predictions by Exxon's own scientists predicted that we would start seeing changes in temperature and also fire behavior around 2000. That's when the impact of elevated CO2 would really start to affect temperature in ways that you and I could sense and feel and measure. And that's exactly what's happened. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more we're going to have in the atmosphere. We're seeing it all over the world. Temperature records are falling everywhere. A lot of this CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, but also the sea absorbs a lot of this residual heat. If you look at sea surface temperature, literally from the Antarctic up to the coast of Ireland and to the North Pole, you're seeing these spikes in temperature, especially this year. We're in a very precarious situation right now, planetarily, Peter, in terms of these changes in temperature levels. One thing it does, it causes drought, it causes heat waves that a lot of us are suffering through, but it also makes forests and neighborhoods much more combustible.
I'm Peter McCully. On this edition of Today in BC, Vancouver's award-winning writer John Valiant has spent 7 years researching his latest book, Fire Weather: The Making of a Beast. The book is an account of the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire and its aftermath. We'll talk about Fort McMurray and parallels that might be drawn between what's happened there and what's happening in British Columbia and the Northwest Territories this year on this edition of Today in BC. Thanks for joining us today, John.
Peter, it's so good to be with you.
We've been seeing extra high temperatures, extreme dryness, a very flammable ecosystem, the boreal forest, all summer long. Perhaps we could start with an explanation of what exactly the boreal forest is and why it's burning in such an explosive manner.
The boreal forest is, you could say, the official forest of Canada. It covers about a third of the province. It also covers a lot of Russia. It covers a lot of Scandinavia, Northern Europe. It touches down on Iceland. It's also a lot of Alaska. One way to visualize it is to look at the globe and you see this green wreath going around the top of it, almost like a halo. And that's the boreal forest. It wraps all the way around and it goes across the top of Canada. And it's the biggest terrestrial ecosystem. So it's a really potent carbon sink, a potent source of oxygen, a potent source of all kinds of resources for animals and humans. It's also really flammable. And one of the reasons it's so flammable is because some of the species that grow there, including the black spruce, can't regenerate unless their cones are heated to temperatures beyond what sunlight can achieve. It sounds counterproductive. Why would a forest want to burn itself down to grow again? And in that sense, it's almost like a phoenix among ecosystems. But what the fire does, what the fire tells the seeds is that, okay, we've burnt the trees down, we've heated the cones up enough to release the seeds. And so the seeds know then, okay, the ground is clear. Now the canopy is open because the trees have burned. So now it's my turn to take in the sunshine, to take in the rain, and I'll grow a new forest. And so most trees are quite young. They're 75, 100, maybe 200 years because they generally burn down before they can get too old.
John, you've done a remarkable job of documenting the Fort McMurray fire and how it impacted the first responders and the residents. And it chronicles the timeline of the decisions that were made as well. Perhaps you could summarize for us that fire, which was not officially put out for 15 months.
This is the Horse River Fire, also known as Fire 9 in the Fort McMurray Forestry District. It ignited sometime in the mid-afternoon of May 1st, 2016, probably human-caused. The cause is actually still unknown, but it was not lightning. It was spotted really quickly because the Alberta Wildfire Service is vigilant, and they knew that 2016 was an exceptionally hot, exceptionally dry spring. Already there were temperatures pushing 30 degrees centigrade when the norm for that part of Alberta is closer to 10 or 12. So it was exceptionally hot, exceptionally dry. This fire ignited. It was spotted around 4 in the afternoon on May 1st. They had a helicopter with a Bambi bucket on it. They had hot shots on it, elite firefighters. They went in and leaned on that thing hard, and they could not suppress it. They called in bombers. And it was simply so hot, so dry. The forest was really a tinderbox. And so there was some wind that afternoon, and that fire spread. It was still kilometers outside of Fort McMurray proper, but people understood the risk, especially with the wind blowing toward town. And then over the next couple of days, what we saw is the wind change. They started putting in cat guards on that side of town, fire breaks. They got set up sprinkler systems. They did a lot of the things that one would do in a rural community like that, even a big city like Fort McMurray that's right on the forest like that. They took all appropriate measures, but what overwhelmed firefighters in the city was the fact that the ground was so hot and dry that even the smallest blowing ember could ignite. When winds picked up on May 3rd, the sparks basically blew right over the tops of the fire breaks, right over the tops of the sprinkler systems on the edge of town, landed right in the middle of people's neighborhoods, in their gardens, in their flower beds, and simply ignited. And I've seen videos, probably a lot of us have, of how that fire spread, and it really looked like these neighborhoods had been sprayed with gasoline, which of course they were not, but that's how hot and dry it was. That's how rapidly the ground and the houses ignited.
One of the descriptions in the book, which stayed with me, was a description of the fire going through one local neighborhood. There was nothing left but a pile of nails. The book talks about the difference between destructive fire and transformative fire.
Most of us have seen a house fire, Peter, unfortunately, and a lot of the house is left when you're done. In fact, most of the damage ends up being done by the water coming from the fire hoses. What we saw instead in Fort McMurray and in Lytton, BC since then, and parts of Kelowna, and really too many places now, are the houses being completely burned basically to nothing. Everything combustible has been charred, and all that's left is ash and scrap metal and piles of nails. And that kind of total combustion is the result of extraordinary heat. And this is something that's different about the 21st century. In the book, I talk about 21st century fire, and there's no question, we're seeing it all summer long right now in Canada, unfortunately, that fires are burning hotter, faster, with greater intensity, with more explosive energy. One way to get a sense of this is to think about the fire that came out of the forest and into Fort McMurray around lunchtime on May 3rd. It was projecting heat of about 500 Celsius. Radiant heat is the heat that you feel coming off a candle. It's why you don't stick your finger in the candle, because the heat coming off the candle says, look, I'm really hot and I'm going to burn you if you come any closer. Imagine that many kilometers wide, coming out of black spruce trees that are 15 meters tall. Now you have this wall of heat that's 500 Celsius, and it's projecting ahead of the fire at the speed of light. That's how fast it moves. And so even before the fire gets there, every tree, every car, every house in front of it is having all the moisture evaporated. Everything is being made tinder dry and super hot. So by the time the flame gets there, it doesn't just catch on fire like when you're trying to start a fire in your fireplace or a campfire. It explodes into flame because it's already 500 Celsius. So these houses didn't burn down the way we're more familiar with in a house fire. They combusted completely and totally. I was talking to firefighters up there, and they said they saw houses go from uninvolved with fire in the basement in 5 minutes. And these are big, strong, well-built houses. They cost $500,000, $750,000 a piece up there. And to see these large state-of-the-art structures disappear in 5 minutes, it almost defies the laws of physics. But that gives you a sense of the ferocity and intensity of the energy being released that day, and being released, frankly, this summer across a lot of Canada.
When you're talking about those big wildfires, you talk about how they can be divided into 3 distinct parts.
And this is not scientific. This is me, a layperson, trying to understand fire behavior. Fires generally start on the ground. They're burning in the grass, they're burning in the leaves, they're burning in the shrubbery. They're quite low. When they're small enough, you and I could put them out ourselves. As they get going, especially if there's a bit of wind there and they get up into the trees, they basically climb up through the branches of the trees, and they might do that through low shrubbery or dead branches. These are called ladder fuels. And so you can imagine the fire just climbing upward. And when you think about what fire likes to do, what gas likes to do, what heat likes to do, it always wants to go up. It's lighter than air. It's ascending. It's aspiring. It's getting up into those treetops. But as it does that, it's also pulling in cooler air because it needs oxygen, just the same way we do. We'll die without it, and so will a fire. How the fire breathes is by pulling in oxygen, air from the surrounding area, but that creates wind. That's pulling the air across the landscape, fanning the flames. Up it goes into the trees, and then you get what's called candling or torching, where the whole tree sometimes will burst into flame, especially in the case of a conifer like a black spruce, which are really flammable. So those things go up like Roman candles, really. Then as they're combusting, they're off-gassing also. And that's really what the fire is feeding on. It's not feeding on the branches or the needles. It's heating the branches and needles up enough so that they off-gas flammable hydrocarbon. So that's why you see in those really frightening photos of Fort McMurray, these kind of refinery fire type clouds of bursting flame above the treetops. Those are the combustible gases igniting. And when you get that kind of heat that we talked about coming into the forest, everything is off gassing like crazy. And that's what the fire wants to burn. That's fire's food, if you want to think about it that way, is vapor. And in order to get the vapor, it needs to heat the object up enough so that it starts to vaporize. And that's the same with a plastic chair or a pool of kerosene or a black spruce tree.
Many of the communities, John, that have been affected by wildfires this year have been close to nature, as Fort McMurray is. You explain that that area has been given a name, WUI, which is an acronym for Wildland Urban Interface.
That's where Canadians like to live. It's really the sweet spot because you've got all the services of a city. You've got a paved road and you've got plumbing and electricity and a place for your kids to ride their scooter. But out the back door is the forest, is nature. And we love that. The trouble is fire loves it too. And so where these big fires are generally coming from is from the forest. When we have built, as we have done over the past 50 years, so many communities that butt right up against wildlands, you're really exposed. And we don't think of it that way. We think of nature as this beautiful, calm, and generally stable place. The forest can literally turn on them and become this attacking adversary that burns their house down in a frighteningly short period of time and sends them fleeing from their neighborhood. And, it's a terrible feeling. It's traumatic. It's dangerous. It's expensive. There's really nothing good about it. This wildland urban interface, it's like a fault line between kind of human ambition and human settlement and our idea of how we want to live and how we want to be in nature. And it's where that vision collides with natural systems. And in the boreal forest in Canada, fire is a natural part of the boreal forest life cycle. But a permanent house, we don't want to be part of that fire cycle. And yet, for the fire, a house with tar shingles, vinyl siding, vinyl windows, all kinds of flammable glue, laminates in the plywood, that's just as good fuel as a tree. And so the fire comes in from the forest and it makes no distinction. It's, wow, it's rectangular and people live in it, but who cares? It's just as flammable. And so the fire is just going to keep going right through it. And that's what we saw in Fort McMurray. The fire just never slowed down. It just went barreling right through these neighborhoods as if it was a continuation of the forest. And that has been a really painful wake-up call, not just for firefighters, but of course for citizens, for insurers, for anybody who's involved with our settlements and our idea of safety and security.
John, in this summer of 2023, we've seen some large-scale evacuations, including Yellowknife and areas of Kamloops, the Shuswap, to name a few. How many people have been forced from their homes?
Peter, my understanding between British Columbia and Nova Scotia over this really terrible summer, around 200,000 Canadians have been forced to evacuate at some point. That's the population of Regina. That's a major Canadian city who has been forced from their homes. Wildfire for Canadians now is really a national security threat. It's a threat to public health and safety, but it's also a threat to our national security. It's so destabilizing to have the entire city of Yellowknife basically on the road. And it's 1,500 K to the nearest big city with good services. So these folks are just out there literally in the wilderness, driving around, trying to get to somewhere else that's safe. Most towns don't have accommodation for 20,000 new arrivals coming in, reeking of smoke and frightened and disoriented and with very few resources. That's the position that fire's forcing us into. And it was the same in Kamloops. You got half an hour to get out of here, but where are you going to go? Most people haven't made that plan. Most people don't know. And you might have a really good plan to go in a particular direction, but the fire could burn across that side of the road. And then you got to go some other place. And this raises the question, Peter, a really serious one. And there are a lot of communities, including Fort McMurray, that have one way in and one way out. And if that way in and way out is blocked by fire, what are you going to do? And that's a really grave question that we haven't resolved yet.
You wrote about the 911 system collapsing in Fort McMurray. Was that during the evacuation, or had most everyone been safely evacuated by that point?
911 is a community alert system, and it's operated by citizens like us calling in to report a fire or a crime or an accident or something like that. And when everybody's evacuating, there's really no one left to call 911. It was interesting in terms of the way a city disintegrates when it's forced to evacuate. But by then, everybody knew there was a fire. Everybody knew that every firefighter available was doing their level best to fight it. And so it almost became moot. You almost didn't need a 911 system anymore because everybody knew what the emergency was. Everybody was bailing out as fast as they could. And all the emergency personnel also knew what the threat was and were addressing it to the best of their ability.
You described, John, the scene of watching camera footage of a security camera inside someone's living room as the fire approached a home in Fort McMurray.
It's an extraordinary video, Peter. I talk a lot about fire's ambition and its character in the book. And fire, it doesn't have a brain, it doesn't think about stuff, but because of its appetite, it needs more fuel, it needs more oxygen, it needs more hydrocarbons to burn. It looks for them, it responds to them. And so watching this nanny cam in this condo in, I believe it was the Abasand neighborhood of Fort McMurray, watching this fire come up around the window, heat the window up so much that it broke. It was almost like the fire was punching its way through the window. And we know that's not possible. But when you watch this 5-minute video, there are lights on in the living room. There's a fish tank that's bubbling away. It's this perfectly peaceful scene that just doesn't have any people in it. And then you see these activities out the window, and then you realize it's fire, and the fire comes in through the window and takes over the room. Because this nanny cam is able to survive in conditions that humans can't, it was able to document what most of us would never live long enough to see, or we wouldn't stay around. We would flee the building. But this camera stayed there and showed us what happens when we're not there, when a fire's coming in. And it's really frightening. It's almost like a horror movie in the sense that the fire's out there and it's determined to get inside. And it does it in an amazingly short period of time when you consider this is a professionally built home that's built with a certain amount of fire retardancy in mind. It's got shingles. This had triple pane glass because it's in the subarctic in Fort McMurray. None of this deterred the fire. It just battered its way through. It just gnawed its way through and burnt the place down.
And Today in BC continues, John Vaillant, and a look at the changing relationship between fire and humankind as we have witnessed firsthand.
From the latest community news to informative, entertaining reads for travelers and the cannabis curious, just visit your local Black Press Media community newspaper website to sign up today.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. I'm Peter McCully. John, in Fort McMurray, you write about reinforcements starting to arrive 2 to 3 days after the fire is torn through town. How did the firefighters and first responders on the ground get supplies and food that they needed in that 2 to 3 day window?
People started running out of food pretty quickly. And this is what was so extraordinary about Fort McMurray, that the whole city evacuated. It's a proper city. There's Walmarts there, there's superstores there, there are huge supermarkets there, there are 7-Elevens and corner stores and all kinds of stuff. Everybody left. These places were empty. In many cases, they were locked up, but not in every case. But by day 2 or 3, police were actually helping firefighters and other first responders get into these supermarkets so they could get food. And they went to the deli aisle and to the soft drink aisle, and they gathered resources because these guys had been working literally 24/7 at a breakneck pace, and they couldn't really go home. Some of their homes had burned down. The fire halls didn't have enough food for that kind of prolonged activity. They helped themselves, and they were very honorable. People kept a tally of what they took. It was not a free-for-all, but it was people under incredible duress, availing themselves and adapting to the situation at hand.
The fires that we've seen this year, John, have really shown no mercy. I was reading a few accounts in our Black Press Media sister papers where many firefighters have lost their own homes and fire halls.
It's incredibly dispiriting. What I learned from the interviews I did with firefighters is obviously they're team players. They're very competitive. They're in it to win it. They're aggressive, proactive folks who go in there and save property. They save lives. That's what they do. That's their self-concept. Imagine people like that going into a neighborhood and you can't save anything. Honestly, I think for some of them, seeing their own houses burn was the least of it. These folks are dedicated to service. And so to not be able to protect the citizens that they're charged with protecting, it's really wounding. This is why I'm here. This is my one job. It's to protect this community, and I can't do it. And so to be disempowered in that way, which is what 21st Century Fire is doing again and again in these communities, really hurts a person. You know, it kind of hurts your spirit, it hurts your soul. And a number of firefighters said to me, quite frankly, we got our ass handed to us. And that's a hard thing for anybody to say. But if you're a competitor and you're used to winning, because firefighters put out fires, to lose on that scale is really hard. And then to lose your house on top of it, that's insult to injury. But I think the real injury is not being able to protect the community in the way that you've been trained to and the way that you really want to.
One of the fallouts from wildfires is particulate, and that can be a health issue for a lot of folks.
It sure can, Peter. What we see is folks who have pulmonary lung issues or heart issues who are maintaining but at risk in normal, healthy air conditions are tipped over into high risk categories when this heavy smoke rolls in. And so what we saw on the East Coast when those fires from Quebec and Ontario started rolling down into the northeastern US, New York City and Washington, D.C. in June, emergency room visits spiked by 20%. These were people who already had pre-existing heart and lung conditions being pushed beyond their ability to maintain and going into some kind of crisis. And that's obviously happening in BC too, all across Canada. The fire can be 200 kilometers from you and you may never see the flames, but the smoke can still touch you. It can still impact your health. It can certainly impact your enjoyment of whatever it is you're doing. You know, when the sun turns orange and the sky turns orange, we're creatures of nature, we're part of nature. And when we see these kinds of big changes to our sky, to our environment, it affects our mood, it affects our spirits, and of course, it affects our physical health, just as it can affect our mental health.
Fire weather details the growth of the oil industry as well as all these events in Fort McMurray and global warming, which in itself is probably a dozen books.
Global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, is well documented. It's well understood. Honestly, Peter, it's not a debate. It's basic science. And people have been understanding and exploring the connections between CO2 and fossil fuels and the heating of the lower atmosphere literally since the 1850s. This is not new science. It's not speculative science. People as smart as you and me, and probably smarter, have been leaning on this subject for practically 200 years now. And so it's really well understood how it works, what causes it. When you look at currently, atmospheric CO2 is 50% higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution, which is when fossil fuels, starting with coal, started to be burned in large quantities. But literally, Peter, as early as the 1890s, scientists were beginning to speculate that, wow, if we keep burning coal on this scale, this is before oil and gas were big. If we keep burning coal on this scale, we're going to produce enough CO2 that we could actually warm the atmosphere. And they were already speculating this. There was anecdotal evidence by the 1930s. By the 1950s, there was scientific equipment that could actually measure parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And many of us are familiar with the Keeling curve, which was first identified in the 1950s, and it shows this very steady rise in CO2 in the lower atmosphere. And along with that, the temperature has been steadily rising. Petroleum companies themselves were doing this science back in the 1960s and 70s. And in fact, predictions by Exxon's own scientists predicted that we would start seeing changes in temperature and also fire behavior around 2000. That's when the impact of elevated CO2 would really start to affect temperature in ways that you and I could sense and feel and measure. And that's exactly what's happened. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more we're going to have in the atmosphere. Methane is also a big contributor to greenhouse gases and to elevated temperature. And we're seeing it all over the world. Temperature records are falling everywhere. A lot of this CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, which turns into carbonic acid, which actually affects the structure of seashells and all kinds of things. But also the sea absorbs a lot of this residual heat. If you look at sea surface temperature, literally from the Antarctic up to the coast of Ireland and to the poles, the North Pole, you're seeing these spikes in temperature, especially this year. We're in a very precarious situation right now, planetarily, Peter, in terms of these changes in temperature levels. One thing it does, it causes drought, it causes heat waves that a lot of us are suffering through, but it also makes forests and neighborhoods much more combustible. That's what we're seeing and feeling now almost every day.
We've been seeing some stranger fire events this year as well here in BC. There were reports of a fire whirl or a fire tornado in Lillooet, which you probably read about. What parallels can we draw from the fires that we're seeing in California and British Columbia and the Northwest Territories, and how do we go about reversing some of these trends?
Fire whirls are relatively common. Think of a dust devil. It's a vortex of wind that creates a little spiral, and that can happen in certain fire situations too. And you get this very distinct spiral of flame shooting up into the air, and they're very dramatic. They're quite beautiful and interesting to look at. You don't want to go anywhere near them, but they are not technically tornadoes. A fire tornado is a new phenomenon, and that's one of these indicators of 21st century fire. There had been no fire tornado prior to 2003, which was the first one occurred in Canberra in southern Australia during a wildfire. And that was an EF3 tornado that tore houses apart and tore trees out of the ground. That didn't happen again until 2018 in Redding, California. And I went down there for that. There's video of it that is really terrifying. So these are 200 plus kilometer an hour winds in fire. And so you get all the destructiveness of a powerful tornado plus the burning energy of an extraordinarily hot, supercharged fire. And I walked the ground in the epicenter of that tornado in Redding, California, after it passed through. And it was destruction, Peter. The only other places I've seen that are in photos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was total destruction, total burning. Gigantic things were torn to pieces and then burnt. It was really frightening, scarring, frankly, to see that. And that literally came out of thin air. That fire was started by the wheel rim on a trailer after it got a flat tire. It threw up some sparks, went into the underbrush lit up, and 3 days later, a fire tornado came into Redding, California, and drove out half the population in an afternoon. And so that's what our atmosphere can do now. It didn't used to be able to do that.
It was an interesting observation towards the end of your book, which I really hadn't seen coming. That was about the insurance companies. A number of the world's biggest insurance companies have announced their intentions to stop insuring or investing in even ultra-high emissions fossil fuel projects like coal and bitumen as a result of the growing data associated with climate change, because they indeed are the gatherers of all this data.
There's so much noise out there, and there's partisan bickering, there's disinformation, there are people who are really focused on one detail but not looking at the big picture. Some of that's natural and some of that is cynically done. But insurance companies really are objective. They are just looking at the data, and what they are seeing, more houses are burning down than used to burn down. And then they look at where they're built. Most of them are in the WUI. We've got this wildfire situation that is now much more intense, much more destructive. We've seen way more property loss in the past 10 years than we have prior. Their bottom line depends on how they do that math. They're really just looking at the numbers. It's nothing personal. It's nothing partisan. They're a business, and their business is covering people who lose their property. But if enough property gets lost, they won't be able to cover it. And so now you have State Farm, huge insurance company, Allstate, another huge insurance company, saying that they will no longer insure new homes or new businesses in the state of California. The state of California has a population about the same as the entire country of Canada. So imagine what that means for anybody wanting to do anything. So that's the domestic side, but there's also the infrastructure side, is petroleum infrastructure. We talked about pipelines and other projects, and there are these major insurance companies who are saying, we don't want to be involved in that, because really what they're doing is they're insuring an industry that makes their job harder, that makes the world more flammable and more dangerous. And these are the facts. And you don't have to take it from David Suzuki, take it from the insurance company, who really is looking at the data. And they recognize that this doesn't make sense for me to insure an industry or a project that's actually going to make the likelihood of fire more likely and make it harder for me to cover the people we are insuring. And some of it, too, I think is ethical. You don't want to have your name, your company associated with activities that are demonstrably harmful to the planet and the people who live on it and depend upon it.
John, it took 7 years to write the book. A lot of information in this book. It's very engaging. I sense that it took 7 years to write it because things are always changing.
You can't believe how fast they're changing, Peter. Honestly, we're living through that this summer. Nobody saw this summer coming. And yet, when Fort McMurray burned, this big, powerful, charismatic city that's really well-resourced, that's well-built, that's full of really competent, hardworking people, to see that city overwhelmed by fire, that was a real wake-up. And when I saw that in 2016, I thought, wow, if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. And that's why I started writing the book. But by then, that was 2016. And in California, the top 10 worst fires they have ever had in their 150-year history have ignited since 2016. The worst fires that BC has ever had, that was 2017, but now 2023 is the new record breaker. Halifax hadn't happened. The Redding fire tornado in California hadn't happened yet. The terrible Tubbs fire that burnt, I think, 9,000 homes in 2017, that hadn't happened yet. These terrible fires in Greece and Spain and Portugal where people are being burnt alive in their cars, that hadn't happened yet. So things are accelerating very quickly, and petroleum companies are starting to notice this and responding in some ways that are shocking to me, frankly. Insurance companies are obviously noticing. Some banks are noticing, and also shareholders and customers and citizens are noticing and saying, hey, why are we financing this and supporting this industry that's actually making our planet more dangerous and is really a hazard to life on Earth? These are conversations that weren't happening all that much before 2016, and now they're happening. And obviously, climate has become a much bigger political hot button issue, and with good reason, because almost everybody now has experienced climate change in some form, whether it's fires on their horizon where they never were before, or heightened temperatures, or terrible smoke that they've never experienced before. Certainly the ocean is tangibly warmer. When I go swimming now, you can feel that it's a tiny bit warmer, and that's really not supposed to be happening, but it is happening now. So all these changes are forcing this subject into the foreground in ways that we didn't have to deal with before.
Thanks to John Vaillant, author of Fire Weather, The Making of a Beast, for being with us on this edition of Today in BC. If you have suggestions or comments, send a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, and Google Podcasts.